Here this afternoon with Bill Pearce, the Acting Vice President for Investment Funds with OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Bill participated yesterday in a very interesting panel looking at how DFIs can help GPs raise private capital. I think it'd be good to recap on some of those themes today, Bill.
Thank you.
But perhaps if you could start by talking about the role that OPIC has played over the last quarter of a century in jumpstarting private equity in emerging markets.
Sure. Thank you very much for this. OPIC, we are the U.S. Developmental Financial Institution, so we have been involved actually since the early 70s, starting off as a political risk insurance. But since then, we now have 4 different lines besides insurance: project finance, SME finance, and my investment group, private equity or investment funds. Investment funds was started in 1987. I think we made our first investment in 91, and we were sort of one of the first DFIs to look at private equity when there weren't that many private equity firms out there. So our job as a DFI was to catalyze private sector money into these private sector focused investment funds, because the OPIC's whole raison d'etre pretty much is to develop and enhance the private sector in the developing world. So we've been doing this now since 91. We've done about 50 funds over that time and about $5 billion of commitments. We presently have about $2.5 billion of active commitments in 35 funds, and we still have a number of funds that have been board approved that we're still trying to get to commitment and to negotiate at the moment. So we're global. We are literally across the board in Latin America, Africa, Asia, the MENA region, Eastern and Central Europe, and Russia. So when we've been there for a number of years and continue to be in those areas.
How has your world outlook evolved since '91? It's a great cross-section of the development of emerging market private equity.
It has been a great cross-section. I think one thing I should mention is that OPIC is also, while we're self-sustaining and developmental, we're also an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. So in the 90s, we probably were doing more funds in Eastern Europe and Russia, given the changes that went on in that part of the world. Over time, we did a lot of investments there, probably a larger part of the portfolio. And then as time went on in the early 2000s, we're doing more in Latin America and Africa, because the world was moving in terms of private equity. And Asia was always a strong component. So these days, we're seeing, Asia has always been, particularly North Asia, East Asia has been more the developed side of the developing world, as was Eastern Europe when during the accession time. Now we're seeing more investment in like Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the MENA region, as well as Latin America. So while priorities sometimes shift, not to the expense of the rest of the world, but sometimes priorities shift for certain foreign policy initiatives.
Absolutely. And your role is to jumpstart, your role is to provide additionality. How do you decide, as different markets reach different stages of maturity, when to pull back and let the markets run on their own?
Well, that's a very good question. It's something we and the other DFIs also have to deal with. Is when is enough? When do we stop? When do they not need us anymore? Is sort of the thing. In our case, we don't have any defined limits per se. However, every time we do approve a fund, we have to convince the board that OPIC's money is needed, that we are not taking out private sector capital.
Right.
And I think the global financial crisis has in many ways shown how difficult even some of the better players how difficult for them to raise capital. So in that way, OPIC can still be additional. Even though they have a track record and may have private sector capital, our capital is aligned with the private sector. So we want to make sure our capital goes in side by side. And so in some cases, particularly earlier on when OPIC was first involved, we helped bring in other capital. So that's sort of the catalytic nature, and I think we still do that, particularly with better named funds, because they need the capital, and if they see the OPIC comprometteur, they will sometimes have other capital come behind it.
And presumably you can, for example, help funds get to that elusive first closing, give the team the confidence, and their prospective LPs the confidence that there will be a fund.
We like to think so. We don't have to. We're not one that has to be in the first close. we could come in later. I probably prefer to be in earlier just because it's easier to get in the first close and then bring in more capital. But we can also come in later stages as well.
Look, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank
this
you very
afternoon.
much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.